Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour. My guest today is an author of a really interesting new book on journalism for the public good. Her name is Kim Kierans. She won the Michener Award at Big Home Books. She's a senior fellow at Massey College at the University of Toronto, where she works with graduate students to produce the Massey podcast. She is a former journalist, a teacher, a university administrator, an international trainer, and a mom to two wonderful children. She's now living in residency at Massey College for the academic year, and she's been chatting, presenting, talking about this launch of her book. And she's told me, and other people have told me, that it's a really fascinating book, and the presentations of the book are like live TED Talks. And so that's interesting. Kim Kierans, welcome to the show. And when you had your most recent book launch, I had numerous different people that I know comment about it so positively and, frankly, trying to create some controversy about it online. So it must have stirred some interest. Congratulations, and thanks for joining us.
Well, thank you so much, Brian, for your interest in the book and having a conversation about journalism. I'm always down for that.
Well, let's do it. So what motivated you to write a book about journalism? Obviously, your long career, but this has a different take, I take it.
Well, the Michener Award, nobody knows about it. If you say, what's, the Michener Award, they'll look at you. And if I say to you, what's the Pulitzer Prize? You know exactly what that meant. It was the top prize in journalism. Well, the Michener Award is this Canada's version, but we're so Canadian. We don't like to celebrate ourselves, do we? So I had been a judge and on the board of the Michener Awards Foundation for 15 years. I'd stepped down. I was on a sabbatical from my teaching at that time. I was teaching at the University of King's College in Halifax. And I thought, the stories that they have recognized and the journalism recognized needs a big shout out. Like this is a difficult time for journalism and for journalists in particular who want to do stories that help citizens understand their world a bit better. So that's what the motivation was.
And tell me a little bit about this book. You review numerous different people that have done good.
Yes, that's a nice way of putting it, Brian. 50 years of really impactful journalism. So think going back to 1970, 71 onward. But I want to highlight a few stories that will still resonate with you, I think. Think about the grassy narrows up in Northern Ontario. That story was generated in 1975. George Hutcherson, a small paper, really the London Free Press, they got onto that story, and still today, I mean, there were protests in September down at Queen's Park. So these stories have important impact. He uncovered the fact that mercury was poisoning the waters and the people who live in Grassy Narrows. And it's still not cleaned up all these years later. Those are the kinds of stories that are so
And
important.
It became a political issue during a provincial election campaign.
Huge, huge, huge. I mean, it still is an election issue in a sense because there are people pressuring for let's get some action done. People are dying. Mitamata disease that ravaged Japan, that's mercury poisoning. It's worse up in Grassy Narrows. And the scientists have shown this. And yet, governments have been very slow. The company involved has been slow to remediate the area. So, it's journalism that brought that to people's attention, and it's journalism that's kept it in the spotlight and helped communities organize for themselves to get change.
And to connect with your book, the reporter won a award.
Yes, George Hutchinson won a Michener Award, went to Rideau Hall. I mean, this is the lovely thing about the Michener Award. It's held at Rideau Hall, Governor General of Canada's residence. You get all dressed up and you go there, and it's a sign that the state, in a sense, an impartial state, not a liberal, conservative, NDP, Greens, but a person at the highest level in Canada says journalism matters. It's an important part of our, what a pillar of democracy, if you want to put it that way.
Okay. Why have people lost confidence in journalism then?
Oh, why people? Well, this has been a long story. So, I mean, I document more than 50 years of a decline in journalism. I mean, I can go back to 1970, the Davey report, where Keith Davey said the business interests of journalism are colliding with the public interest aspects of journalism. So there's this built-in tension. Public interest pisses off people. So, the Toronto Star, for instance, when it did its race and crime series in the 80s, or was it the 80s? Anyway, advertisers threatened to pull all their advertising out. When they did the Rob Ford story, advertisers threatened to pull their advertising. Well, there's the business interest, but the journalism interest is for you and me and for your listeners and viewers. It's to say, you should know about this, and then you make your mind up about what you think about it. We're going to give you the information. So there's this tension that's built in, and it managed, there used to be this firewall, the editorial was on one side, the advertising on the other. But as advertising has eroded, as subscribers have stopped subscribing to papers, as they've all moved on to the internet, we have a funding problem. How do you pay for journalism? It costs. Journalism costs money. Salaries cost money. Investigations cost money.
And the sort of the farm team or the process that one can become a national journalist has changed fairly dramatically, hasn't it? With the death of many local newspapers. How does a journalism student get started? How does a journalist get started when you've only got a couple of national dailies left?
Well, it's not quite that dire. Let me assure you, it's not quite that dire. I was looking on the Canadian Association of Journalists website this morning, and they have a section called Jobs, and there were jobs being offered at some startups, Narwhal, Tyee. These are online publications. There were jobs at the Toronto Star. There were some jobs at CBC, and there are the Brandon Sun is looking for a night reporter. So there are jobs out there, but yeah, I mean, if you think you're going to graduate from a journalism school or from some other program, a college, and expect to walk into being the covering Parliament Hill or a foreign correspondent, that's not really how it works. It works by doing all the grunt stuff that I did as a young reporter that that we all do, and we work our way to where we want to be, or we find another career.
Tell us a little bit about the grunt stuff you did. You did as a young reporter.
Oh, as well. I mean, I fell into journalism really. I never thought I would be, but I worked in. I'm a big fan of local news. So I started off working in local newspapers, community newspapers, because I think that's where the rubber, hits the road, so to speak. That they make huge differences. The reporters. So I started off in local news. Joined CBC on my 21st birthday, and we opened up a radio station in Charlottetown. And I'm dating myself here, but it was 1977. And so I've been around the block. I mean, it was exciting to open up a radio station, build an audience, because at that point, CBC had been rebroadcast on a private station, CFCY. So I learned radio on the ground in a small station that had no listeners. And I was grateful for that. I've covered, municipal politics is my real passion. I've done legislatures. I was on a national program called Media File that looked critically at media, looked critically at what we were doing wrong and how we could do things better. It eventually was canceled. But it was a really interesting experience because media don't like to put themselves under the microscope. And then I did research for national elections and provincial elections, and then ended up on the assignment desk. And this was at a time when there was, cutbacks and changes and digital work. So I mean, I ended up, broadcasting as doing newscasts, 12 newscasts a day. And you know what this is like. You're a broadcaster. And assigning and editing all at the same time, and learning how to work my own board, and it was a lot of fun. Eventually went into teaching and kept up a column called Community News, because I really do believe there's the real loss. I mean, you're in Toronto, and Toronto has all kinds of media, but I live in Halifax. And I see what's going on in rural Nova Scotia, rural New Brunswick, PEI, Newfoundland and Labrador, out west in those outside of those main centers. There is a real dearth, a news desert. when it comes to covering municipal politics, city hall or no, town hall, school boards, health, social services. Newspapers are printing the minutes of the town council. There's no reporter covering it and asking questions. And the council will love that. But what service is it really to the public? How can they make informed decision? I came home this weekend to Halifax to vote in a civic election because I feel strongly about being present. But I was able to go online thanks to the Coast, Halifax Examiner. Those aren't mainstream papers. I was able to look at who was running, what their platforms were. So those are the kinds of, I'm worried about local news.
Well, I'm really worried about local news in the Toronto area as well, though, even though you mentioned that we've got the national newspapers. This radio station is Saga 960, and so it represents the west end of Toronto, Mississauga, Brampton, etc. And to get a reporter from one of the major newspapers in downtown Toronto, or CBC, or CP24, to actually come to Mississauga to cover something,
Well, I know.
would
I
never
agree.
happen.
Well, I mean, except the Toronto Star has Noor Javid, who's doing the suburbs, as it's called. But that's only one person, and there are so many stories. I was talking to her recently, and she said, I can't keep up. There are so many stories in the so-called suburbs outside GTA. And she said, and they're good stories and they're important stories. And we really do. I agree with you. We need to put more emphasis on that, not just the Star, but I mean all the media. But it's way worse out.
There's 29 towns and cities around Toronto
Yeah,
that all have mayors and councils and whatnot that deserve to be council that make up the Greater Toronto area. But all the attention is on one of those 29.
yeah, yeah. But I agree with you. We're singing the same hymn.
Well, we're going to have an interesting conversation today because we're going to talk a little bit more about some examples of why journalism is important. Then we're going to talk a little bit about who is going to pay for this kind of journalism. We're going to talk about the business model of journalism and why our guest Kim Kierans thinks it's broken. And then we're going to talk about some solutions to fund journalism and how to keep the lights on. This is going to be a really interesting conversation. The final one that we're going to talk about is how to restore trust in journalism, which I think is most important. Stay with us, everyone. We're going to be back in 2 minutes with Kim Kierans talking about journalism in Canada today. Stay with us. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour. My guest tonight is Kim Kierans. She is the author of a new book called Journalism for the Public Good, the Michener Awards at 50. It's just been published. She's done a couple of really interesting book announcements, book launches about it that some of my friends have commented about it being a really provocative and interesting conversation about journalism and the future of journalism. Kim is a senior fellow at Massey College at the University of Toronto, where she works with graduate students to produce the Massey podcast. She's a former journalist. She's a teacher, a university administrator, an international trainer, and a mom. What a great background, and a pleasure having you join us. So, you've talked a little bit about how important journalism is. Let's take a couple of minutes and give us some of the stories that you include in your book, if you would, of how important journalism is. Because you've given me a list of some that are really quite interesting. And I'd love to hear more about some of these stories. The Montreal Gazette and Girls Reform, a class action lawsuit. Tell us about that if you could.
The class action lawsuit was Rafe Mayer, CKNW in Vancouver. He decided to take on the BC government and the federal government over the building of a dam, the Camino Dam, back in the 1990s, early 1990s. And he used the airwaves kind of like a pulpit to rally support for his advocacy in a sense. So this is a kind of an advocacy story. But in the process of it, Tom Sidden, who is federal minister, decided to sue him for defamation. And it was eventually settled out of court. But the Michener Awards Foundation, this is really interesting. They submitted all the coverage, and when the list of final nominations, those who were nominated came out, and people out west, certain groups out west saw Rafe Mayer's nomination being a finalist. the Michener Foundation was deluged with a bunch of letters opposing the nomination, calling for it to be rescinded. And there was really, I mean, there was some very, very hateful emails going back and forth. And the Michener Foundation uh, decided that lawsuit or no lawsuit, that they would proceed and it would stand. And the independent judges, and this is the thing about about why the Michener Award is above other awards, in that it's not judged by peers. The foundation can't pressure the judges into sort of saying, well, this is dangerous. You should, not do it. And the judges proceeded. And the night of the awards, when Rafe Mair won, uh, he was able to get up on this, or Shirley, I forget her last name, but she got up for Rafe Mair, and it was a real victory for freedom of speech, for against people who want to shut you down. And that's what journalism does. It really does um, uh, help people, say, okay, we can find out information even when those in authority don't want us to know. And it was quite a wonderful story. And but the lawsuit, it was settled privately. We never knew how much Rafe Mair had to pay Tom Siddon, but it was a courageous thing to do. And the dam did not get built. And the thing is that Rafe Mair loved, he's no longer with us, but loved salmon fishing. So he could still go salmon fishing.
Tell us
So the
about the testing of tasers and the death of this gentleman in 2007.
Yes, so that, I mean, that was a really interesting example. We're talking about new models of going forward in journalism. Well, this is one of the earliest partnerships where you've got a partnership between two supposedly competing companies, CBC and the Canadian Press. And they were both working on the taser story after Robert Jasinski had been killed by security guards who tasered him, and police that tasered him at the airport when he became loud, vocal, aggressive.
Is
And
this
they
in
take,
Vancouver?
yeah, this was the
I
Vancouver.
remember the
Yeah,
story. Yeah.
yeah. There's a lot of stories in this book that you will remember, Brian, because you're a news consumer. Anyway, so the two organizations well, they were both working on the story, and they said, let's partner, let's both take on two different angles and combine our information, so therefore there'd be more information, it would be more complete reporting. And so what they found was, in fact, that most of the tasers that police were using at the time were set way too high. So if you if you got tasered, you might be getting, a lethal shot, as Jasinski did. And because of that, there were new protocols put in place, and there were new for the use of tasers, and for the how they were set and how they were tested, and that stands today.
And you quote about another partnership on the Greenbelt controversy. Tell us
No, the
about
green
that.
belt. So that was the winner, in fact, was this past year, 2023. It was Toronto Star, Noor Javid, and also Narwhal. Again, another partnership. And you see the development of how media is working, in the sense that you've got this established media company, the Star, and then this newer online media outlet, the Narwhal. And so between the two of them, they combined forces and did extensive coverage that is still going on. If you pick up the Star or you read Narwhal, there are still stories today that are just continuing to cover it. And that's the interesting thing about this kind of journalism. Just because you win a big journalism award, the story's not over. The story continues. And the story continues with, the green belt. The story continues with the mercury poisoning up in Grassy Narrows from 1975 on. The story doesn't die. And that's the important thing that I think I learned in writing this book. And it came very early in my research. I did more than 50 interviews with journalists and various people who had been nominated for the Michener Award about their stories. And Gillian Cosgrove was a young reporter at the Montreal Gazette back in 1974, 75. And she wanted to find out what life was like at these reformatory schools for young girls. And And she went and asked, she did the proper thing, and they said no, I think a couple of times. She went to her boss and said, "Can I go undercover?" And that was one of the early times. So she went, she applied for a job as a directrice, and she got a job as working as a guard almost with these young women. And what she reported was absolutely horrifying. There were girls that were in there for truancy. There were girls in there for their parents couldn't take care of them, so they were in there for just keep safe keeping. If they would be tied up, put in a basement, and like literally tied up onto a bed where they were not, they couldn't use the bathroom. And so you can imagine what happens after 12, 14 hours being tied up. And for minor things, talking back, you'd get thrown in. This is what she observed and reported on. There were changes that happened from her reporting, hence she won the award in 1975. But she said, I thought, oh, I've changed everything. I've won a Michener Award. Everything's going to be great for these young women. And she said, I went on my merry way. 40 years later, she hears from some women who had been in this reform school, and they say that it continued. The abuse, the neglect, the harassment all continued even after that, even though there had been various stories. And now she's involved in a class action lawsuit that they're doing. She's helping them with their class action lawsuit. And she's got a book that I think is going to be coming out in the next year with Sutherland Press. So Sutherland House, yeah. So these stories have long legs. They also, when that story came out, it spurred a bunch of other newspapers across Canada to say, what's going on with our reform schools? How are we treating young people in incarceration? And so you had stories out in Alberta, you had stories elsewhere in Toronto, and that's it. So it has a ripple effect.
You also, I understand in the book, talk a little bit about who's going to pay for this kind of journalism and how there has been support in over time from governments. I think that there's been really quite a lot of controversy of late because of this new bill where if you don't pay, if Google and Facebook don't pay, they don't get to publish newspaper articles in Canada. And then local newspapers, local media have been complaining that all the money is going to just the big guys and none of it's being shared with the smaller people. So, who's going to pay for the type of journalism that you've been just talking about?
Oh boy, that is a big question. If I had the answer, we would be all a lot happier. I mean, right now we're trying everything. I think I'll come to public policy interventions in a bit, but I mean, advertising. I mean, there's still room for advertising, and we see that. La Presse, for instance, is gone all online, and it's average. A lot of its revenue still comes from advertising. But Quebec is quite a different model from us. You've got subscribers where you've got a lockdown subscriber model. In Nova Scotia, we have allnovascotia.com, and it is thriving. It is making money, and it puts its money back into hiring more reporters rather than, there's crowdfunding. So you think about, let's sponsor Brian to do a story. And so, your listeners would send in money so that you could go off and do a certain kind of story. So there's that kind of thing. Micropayments, the Toronto Star's trying, micropayments. If you like this article, pay X amount for just to read the article. You've got things that are patrons. In the old days, back in the Middle Ages, you'd have a patron who would support your arts and culture. The Globe and Mail has the Thompson family, so that's kind of nice. But there's also other patrons. Citizens unions will often support various outlets, media outlets. Philanthropy is a thing that is not really, it has not caught on in Canada the way it is in the US. The US, they fund a lot of journalism, these big, foundations. I see partnerships. I think that there's more media becoming registered charities, or not for profit, so that we can give a donation to your program and get a tax receipt. But what that means is, of course, if you're a charity, the owners don't make money. And then there's the policy, public policy interventions. I think at some point, we have to have a discussion about, I think government has always had some hand in subsidizing media. I mean, you pre-Confederation, the newspaper lobby, started the subsidies for postal so that you could go and that they could have cheap postal rates to mail out their newspapers to people in rural areas because there was still the concern about people in rural areas not getting information. So that subsidy has continued. I think it's now called the Canadian Periodical Fund, and it includes online and other things. So there's always been a hand in government. I mean, CBC is the biggest subsidy of all, and that was the conservative government of R.B. Bennett in the 30s that founded that. But that back then there was this idea that the businesses didn't want, we were fighting against the cultural industry in the States. Think about it. We live north of the largest cultural producer in the world. And there was a sense that Canada would be swallowed up into that narrative, into that sort of, we would become American. And so in order to stay Canadian, we wanted to build, the governments at that time, the Bennett government in particular, wanted to build a media and a country that was independent and could have its own voice. And it had support from the business community. The business community found that the American advertising and Americans that were coming into the Canadian airwaves, especially in the 30s, was siphoning off, shoppers. And they wanted to create this, Mary Vipond writes about this beautifully. And anyway, so we have a national policy, and we have this idea that at that point, that as a country, we wanted to have our own identity, and media was a great way to share stories. I'm living in Halifax. I want to hear what's happening in your area. I want to hear what's happening in Vancouver. They might want to hear what's happening in Halifax. This whole idea of broadcasting, broadsheet newspapers, that's all changed. And we have to ask ourselves we have to have a national conversation. What is
Well, it
Canada?
sounds like I think we're probably going to, because don't we have almost a unique situation right now where we've got a leader of the official opposition who looks like he's going to form government, who's talking about defunding the CBC, and lately looks like he has been attacking the president of CTV for editing that he thinks has been inappropriate. So we've never had a situation, have we, where government and potential government has been so in opposition to Canadian media?
It is curious. It is curious. And the thing is that I would love to hear what is the alternative. What are we what we're going to? I just don't know. But it is curious that this is happening. It's almost like a spillover from the States, in a sense, from the negativity towards media, rather than saying what is the value? What value does journalism bring to Canada, to how we operate and how we live? I mean, let's face it, journalists have always been in opposition to whoever's in power. I mean, that's our, we're supposed to be that. That's what we're supposed to question. We're supposed to ask questions. And I've never met a government that liked us, quite frankly, despite what the opposition might say.
But has there ever been a government that is so opposed and calling it fake media and
No.
suggesting that not only editors but people in the C-suite are so opposed to you that they're willing to edit tape to your disadvantage?
Well, I don't know the details behind that. That I don't know. But what I do know is that there is this distrust you talked about earlier between, I mean, media and government. I think it's been sort of blown out of proportion, maybe, and that the conversation has to become, what is the value of media? What do they do? How do we restore trust in media? How do we have a media that's independent? I mean, if journalists are finding out in the field, they're being spit on, pushed, they're being yelled at, they're being shouted down, they're not allowed to ask questions. is this really good for society? Is this really good for how we operate as a country, as a community? I would argue, nah.
I agree with you, but they seem to think collectively that the media is fake and the media is slanted and it's left wing, and so therefore to combat that, they've got to do exactly what you've said, which is diminish the stature of the media so that they can get their own news out. Anyway, we've got to take a
Yeah.
break for some messages, and we're going to come back in just 2 minutes with Kim Kierans, and we're going to
Okay.
explore further what's wrong with the business model, which is her other argument about that just the business model is broken. Kim, I read two newspapers that I get delivered to my door every day. I'm told I'm like the most unique, remaining, factor within the news media that no one, people laugh at me when they see my two newspapers get delivered every morning. Every Sunday, I get the Sunday New York Times, which I love and adore. People laugh at me for still getting the Sunday New York Times every Sunday. Let's come back and talk about the business model in just 2 minutes. Stay with us, everybody. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. I'm chatting tonight with Kim Kierans. She is the author of a new book called Journalism for the Public Good, the Michener Awards at 50. Kim is a senior fellow at the Massey College at the University of Toronto, where she works with graduate students to produce the Massey podcast. She's a former journalist, teacher, university administrator, international trainer, and a mom. Kim, we were just talking about government support for media and how it's changed over time, and frankly, some of the disagreements with people for media today. I want to ask you. We're going to talk about the business model and how it's broken in a minute, but I take a look at particularly American broadcast media, and I think it's entertainment. It's not journalism. Isn't that and even some of the Canadian media at times becomes close to that. I think it's still more journalism than it is entertainment. But the Power and Politics show and the Insider Report ends up getting very close to what you see on Fox or CNN or CNBC. Is part of the problem us that we want to be entertained rather than informed?
That's a great question. Again, I don't know if I can really answer that, but what I can, I think that we've blurred the lines between news and infotainment, if you want to call it, and we're sort of want to amuse ourselves to death because there's a lot of bad news out there, and people say, "Oh, I don't want to hear bad news. I don't want to hear bad news." But what's our role as citizens? Are we giving up freedoms? And I think as citizens, we have to actually, look at the hard things that are going on in our society and say what's working and what's not working. And it's important for us to decide, are we going to just are we going to co-opt our decisions to government only without having a say in it? Or are we going to say, oh, the government did this, we don't like it. Think about Jody Raybould and think about, all the, people who have stood up and said, I don't like that, what you did, and leave. I think we need more of that. We need more discussion. There's a lot of top down in our politics now, and people are feeling alienated. And I think this is what it is there's a real alienation. So you saw that with the convoy, a huge alienation in our country. People don't feel that they are listened to in any way at all. But getting rid of the media is not the answer. I mean, quite frankly, that's a public space. It's one of many public spaces that are out there now.
But it looks like we're going to get a premier in British Columbia, and we've got already a premier in Alberta that really were very supportive of the convoy and very anti-vaccines, and so therefore, arguably, they're saying don't get your information from national media, get it from comments on Facebook, get it from some of these smaller echo chamber kind of sources of information that many people are listening to today.
That's what's happening. You're right. From my point of view, I think it's important to read widely and broadly. So, I just don't confine myself to the Star and the Globe. I read the Post and I read Millennial Post and I go on to Rebel News and I read widely because I think it's important to understand all the different points of view out there, the hub. I mean, various things like that. I think it's important to, consider other arguments. We're becoming siloed.
But you're very unique. The vast majority of people don't
Oh
do
yeah,
that.
I agree. I agree.
They only listen to news they want to listen to because it's the news that reiterates their point of view.
And that's what the internet has done for us. It's created these silos, and we can curate our own news. We can talk to ourselves in what they call the echo chambers, our own echo chambers. I think that we need to think about what is the value of a shared conversation as citizens. What is the value of a shared conversation where we have different points of view, where we say, where it's not a uni view, but we actually look at different points of view and we have a conversation. And I think we've lost that ability, and that, of course, bodes well for civil society. It bodes poorly, rather, for democracy and the future of our country, in a sense. Are we going to
Maybe
just all become civil libertarians? I don't know.
maybe I'm using way too many American examples. I apologize for this, but you probably saw this reporter last week that asked J.D. Vance, the vice presidential nominee for the Republican Party, 5 times if he thought that Trump had lost the 2020 election, and he refused to answer and tried to shift the conversation and the questions every time for 5 times. And the reporter was incredibly diligent, kept on asking 5 times. But how can you have a conversation if people
Well,
refuse to answer the question?
but doesn't that say so much? As a viewer, what I said is, oh, he doesn't want to talk about this. What's he hiding? I had this sort of thing. Well, it says a lot. I mean, as a viewer, as a citizen, I could make my own decision about what I thought about J.D. Vance and his reluctance to be honest and transparent. I was but it says a lot about the fact that we either people start saying that media matters and journalism matters, and and science, sort of journalism. I mean, we all have biases, but the fact is that we're the evidence-based journalism. Stories are never complete, and that's what my book shows: is that stories continue to develop. We do, as journalists, we do the best we can with the information we have, and the story changes, just like the science during COVID changed, right? As they got more information. Well, that's how stories are. But without that trust that journalists are actually working for citizens, it's really, really hard to gain that trust.
You got a whole section on the business model and how it has to change or how it
Mm.
is changing. Tell me about why you think the business model is broken.
Well, it started crumbling a long time ago. I mean, this isn't just the social media and internet, as much as everyone likes to think. As I said earlier, the Davy Commission in 1970 said business interests are colliding with public interest, right? At that point, there's 58% change. 1980, 10 years later, Tom Kent's Royal Commission, he said competition is virtually dead. That's 1980, a long time ago. And he also said that it's contrary to public interest. We don't, I think it was Keith Davies said, we don't make widgets. Journalism isn't there to make widgets. Journalism is there to raise questions and to point out what's going wrong in society, what's going good too, and to have that national conversation. The 1990s economic recession, we all remember that, and some of us do anyway. The closures, there was a lot of media closures, buying and selling, and consolidation started. And then you've got the arrival of the internet, that internet. And I remember when that happened around 2000, publishers were saying, oh, it's a passing fad. Have you heard that recently with AI? It's a passing fad. It'll go away. No problem. We're going to keep killing trees and publishing on print. And they started giving away their news for free. That was, I think, their big mistake right there. And then because they wouldn't adopt the internet, Craigslist and eBay stole all that classified advertising, which really was the was the absolute gravy train for newspapers. Stole it, and they didn't know how to get it back, and they've never got it back. And then they started, when you've got all the classifieds online, well, where are the viewers going to go, or the readers? So the audience started moving online as well. So we're talking long, early before social media. There was convergence. They thought, oh, Rogers and BCE and all the big, telecommunication companies started saying, oh, we'll get the pipes and we'll merge everybody and we'll make money. And so all of a sudden, news that was originally a printer who started a paper, who had advertising and thought news would bring more readers. Now we're into a multi-company, with many company, a big conglomerate with many companies, and news is a small component of it. And you see that now with BCE. The news element is part of a much bigger operation. So between 1994 and 2012, $45 billion spent back and forth buying, and selling media companies, and some colossal failures. Remember CanWest Global? Yeah, that was a huge thing. And then social media came in, and it just created these little silos you talked about earlier. These silos of I'm going to curate my news. I'm going to just get all the stuff I want about fluffy dogs, or I just want to watch cat videos all day. And that's not news, but people think it might be. And
Or
so,
worse, that I only want to get to news that has my slant, my
yeah.
ideological slant, and often it's whether it's a conspiracy theory or it's
Mhm.
one point of view or very one slanted, very politically extreme. I think that's one of the big risks we got today.
Oh, yeah, absolutely, absolutely. And so now we're at a situation where you've got the local news media project, got some sun, local news media project, and between 2008 and August of this year, there were 525 local media that closed. 76 or three-quarters of them were community media, the media that you talked about earlier, the small, they closed. There were a bunch of, but you see new media outlets starting, 387. But of course, probably about 158 of them have either closed or cut back. So it's really hard to find your niche in this
So
market.
that's my question. How's the business model going to morph? How's it going to change? How are media going to make money? But we got to take a break because we got to make some money, and we're going to cut away for some messages for 2 minutes. We're going to come back with some concluding comments, and I want to ask him the two final questions: What's the solution, and how do we regain trust in media? Back in 2 minutes,
Mm.
everybody. Stay with us. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour. My guest tonight is Kim Kierans. She is the author of a new book that sounds really interesting. I've got to get it. It's called Journalism for the Public Good, the Michener Awards at 50. And what she does is reviews a whole bunch of the interesting stories over time that have won this, the Pulitzer Prize Award of Canada, the Michener Awards, talks about how they're relevant. And then she also talks about, why the business model has been harmed and what her solutions are. And then finally, Kim, we've got to address how we're gonna regain trust. So real quick, what are your solutions to the business model, and how are we going to regain trust in the media?
Oh man, that's a big question, Brian. So I mean, I think that the journalism and citizens need to actually step up. I think media outlets have to engage citizens through things like public forums, editors' office hours, show them that what they care about really matters. I think that we have to the civic function of journalism has to be recognized, and my hope really comes from journalists. There are new online models emerging, Narwhal, National Observer, The Logic. There's slow media, which is doing in-depth things, The Sprawl in Calgary, hyper-local media. You've got the Parkdale Villager in Toronto, Tartan Press in New Brunswick, for instance, and partnership models. The Investigative Journalism Foundation out of Winnipeg. You've got the Investigative Journalism Bureau with the Dalla Lana School of Public Policy in Toronto. So there's all these things that are happening. I think we need to somehow decide and have a conversation about, do we care about this? And I think it's got to be a conversation that goes beyond just, defunding the CBC or anything like that. It's got to be a higher level conversation, taking out the political partisanship and to say to Canada, what kind of country do we want to be? And journalists and journalist organizations have to operate on principles of verification, authenticity, and transparency. We need to be transparent about our sources and about how we put together our stories and engage citizens. I mean, citizens are important. They've always been. Why do we do this? We don't do it for our bosses. We do it for people that read, listen, and that have stopped, and we want them back.
Are you optimistic or pessimistic about the future for journalism?
I'm always optimistic. Always. I mean, journalism is the media organizations may come and go, but there are always people who want to tell stories. There's always, and they will find a way, whether it's Substack or whatever. Or on
Your
your show.
mom, your
Yeah.
mom, if
Yeah.
one of your children came and said, I don't want to go and get a law degree. I don't want to go and get an MBA. I don't want to become a lawyer and or a business person to make lots of money. I want to become a journalist. What would you tell
I
them?
I have a daughter who's a digital media artist, so I say whatever you want to do, go do it. I mean, if you've got the passion, absolutely. We need more of you. As one investigative journalist said, we're unicorns, and I want to see more unicorns.
Kim Kierans, thank you so much for joining us. I really
Thank
appreciate
you.
it. Tell us all what the name of the book is and where we can get it.
So it's Journalism for the Public Good. The Michener Awards at 50. It's Bighorn Books at University of Calgary Press. It's on Amazon or at your local bookseller.
Thank you so much for joining us. That's our
Thank you,
show for tonight,
Brian.
everybody. I encourage all of you to watch media. You can watch me. I'm on every night at 6 o'clock on 960 AM. You can stream me online, even from Halifax at www.saga960am.ca. And all of my broadcasts, as soon as the radio show goes to air, are put on social media, are put on YouTube, and are put on podcast service. So you get lots of different ways that you can get my long form interviews that are also very unique. Thanks for joining us, everybody. Kim, thank you. I really appreciate it.
Thank you so
That's our
much,
show for
Brian.
tonight, everybody. Good night.